Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4. To begin, we're going to do a recap from last week, which will cover the first few slides. So the first question I have is, what is the difference between a block and undulating training plan? And as we discussed, block training is focused on one key performance indicator or KPI. For example, you could be just training speed for a set period of time, 4 to 6 weeks, 8 weeks, up to 12 weeks, or just endurance-based work for that period of time. And undulating provides a variety of stimuli. So you could be working on speed, mixed with endurance, mixed with HIIT intervals within a week or within a mesocycle, which could be up to 6 to 8 weeks. So undulating doesn't have a sole focus. It's without a sole focus on one KPI. Instead, it provides a variety of stimuli. So there's different types of undulating. There could be daily undulating, where you're changing the stimulus every day. Or it could be weekly undulating, where you have a week of speed, then a week of HIIT intervals, then a week of endurance, and you rotate that way. So the second question I have is, what factors affect which type of training plan you use? Well, it really comes down to the goals of the client, the time available to train, the functional ability of your client, the classification of your client as beginner, intermediate, or advanced, and the baseline fitness level of your client. The third question, as a recap from last week, is what is the main difference between the types of cardiovascular training? So the main difference really is in fit, so the frequency, intensity, and time. So there's this trade-off between volume and intensity, such that when intensity increases, the volume, or the number of reps or time under tension, has to decrease. And the same holds true for high volume work. It's linked with lower intensity work. Because if you have high volume and high intensity at the same time, this is a recipe for overtraining and induced fatigue. So that's a little recap from last day. Now we're going to move into another slide that recaps what we talked about last week. Here is a slide that we talked about last day about the basic ranges for training types based on an undulating training plan. Okay, the key here is it's basic ranges and it's based on an undulating training plan. So this is when you have that variety in stimulus per week. So the frequency per week is dictated by the fact that this is an undulating plan. So you could have 1 to 2 days of long, slow distance training, 1 to 2 days of pace tempo thresholds, 1 to 2 days of interval, 1 day of HIIT, and 1 day of fartlek. And that would encompass your daily undulating training plan. The key here that I want you to see is that there is this fluctuation in duration of work, which is your volume, and your intensity, such that as the intensity increases, so as we get closer to those HIIT and the intervals, that you get close to your VO2 max, the duration of the work in that workout, the actual quality work, is reduced. So when duration or volume is high, intensity is low. And when intensity is low, the volume of work that you do is high. And this is a basic fluctuation that needs to be considered for each training plan when it comes to cardiovascular training. Otherwise, if you have high volume and high intensity at the same time, it's a recipe for that overtraining and greater induced fatigue. Now I want to provide you with a sample program. This individual is a beginner elderly woman who prefers to start walking. So we have week 1, week 2, and week 3 here. We have our weekly plan, so Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then the total training load, okay, which we'll talk about as well. So this individual is classified as having a poor cardiovascular fitness level. She's a beginner. And as such, I would choose more of a block periodized plan for this individual. So we would just focus on improving her cardiovascular fitness not through a variety of stimuli. No, we'll just work at doing one key performance indicator, and that's just improving her aerobic fitness. And this would be through a block periodized plan. So as you can see in week 1 in the afternoon, we have a walk. So I said try for 20 minutes with an RPE. I modified this so it's not out of a scale from 6 to 20. Instead, I put it out of 10, so 1 to 10. because this is more realistic for some individuals. They're better able to gauge a 1 to 10 in a modified Borg scale than a 6 to 20, which sometimes it's a little bit arbitrary. So for this, I set an RPE of about 4. So it's relatively low intensity or moderate intensity, light to moderate intensity for 20 minutes. The key here is that I set afternoon walks because this is an elderly individual and sometimes the morning is harder on the joints. And so I always suggest an afternoon walk for an elderly individual once the body is warmed up from just life. So avoid the morning where cardiovascular myocardial infarctions are at highest risk in this population. So I always say afternoon for exercise. So this would be Sunday, try for 20 minutes. Tuesday, again, we upped it a little bit to 25 minutes. The RP is still the same, so the intensity is still the same. We just increased the volume by 5 minutes. Thursday, again, repeat Tuesday. So an afternoon walk of 25 minutes. And then Saturday is an afternoon walk of 25 minutes. Now, I would adjust this depending on the feedback I get from my client. If this is too much or not achievable, or if it's too easy and they can achieve it easily, then that actually is a good thing for the first week to reinforce positive behavior. So in the total training load, I added up all the minutes. So in this case, it's 95 minutes. The total rating of perceived exertion for the week was 4 sessions times a 4 RPE, which is 16. And then this is how I calculated load. And it has arbitrary units. That means there's no units. It's just an arbitrary number. But what you're doing is you're tracking over time the increase or decrease to help you track load. Okay, that's the volume times intensity. So here the load would be the time, which is 95 minutes, times the cumulated RPE for the week. And in this case, it equals 1,520. So that would be our arbitrary training load monitoring. Okay, so for week 2, we have an afternoon walk. I upped the duration up to 30 minutes. And I said, okay, this should be like a moderate intensity at a 5 out of 10. And then Tuesday, again, an afternoon walk of 30 minutes, RPE of 5 out of 10. Thursday, 30 minutes, RPE of 5 out of 10, and then Saturday again. So I didn't do anything different with the frequency. I increased the volume, no greater than 10% per week, and I increased the RPE, so they might be walking a little bit more briskly, but it's such a mild increase. So the total time for that week would be 120 minutes. Their RPE would be accumulated at 20, and the load increase therefore would be 2,400. So that was a quite big jump from the previous week. Now, if this isn't achievable, then I bring it back to a couple weeks of similar to week 1. Okay, so the goal here is really get this woman to start getting 150 minutes of physical activity where your heart is pumping per week. And that, remember, is the Canadian standard. So week 3, again, increasing or keeping the same duration, but now we're increasing, we're adding some tempo. So 3 times 5 minutes of tempo, where she would walk for 5 minutes at an RPE of 7. So it's a little bit more brisk. And then she would walk at a lower RPE or lower intensity for 5 minutes. And she would do this 3 times. On Tuesday, an afternoon walk at a moderate intensity for 35 minutes. Thursday, we would repeat Sunday's workout, which is a little bit more tempo. And then Saturday, we would have a nice moderate intensity walk of 35 minutes. So now our total training load for that week is 130 minutes times an RPE, accumulated RPE of 22, which is 2860. So as you can see, the training load is increasing over those 3 weeks. Typically for the 4th week, I would kind of bring her back down a little bit. I wouldn't continue to push her. I would have a little bit of a deload week where I'd reduce the volume and intensity just to keep her fresh and not inducing too much fatigue. So really the goal is to achieve that 150 minutes per week for health, and we progressively overload to get there. So now let's review what a cardiovascular session should look like. As you can see on the graph on the y-axis, we have heart rate in beats per minute, and on the x-axis, we have time in minutes. So the first 0 to 5 minutes, we see a steady increase in heart rate, and that's considered to be the warm-up. So slow increase of heart rate and body temperature. So this typically is a minimum of 5 minutes of progressive warm-up to the intensity of your cardiovascular training session. Okay, and then we have in the middle, From the dotted line to the right dotted line, we see 30 minutes at the target heart rate. Okay, so this would be the quality work. This is the stimulus that's driving the physiological change. And then at the end of that 30 minutes, you have a progressive decrease in the intensity, and this is your cool down. Okay, so it's slow aerobic, and then some people suggest stretching after that. But my goal always is the cool down lasts until your heart rate is less than 100 beats per minute. So this is a typical how you would standardize a cardiovascular training session. At least 5 minutes of a warm up, bringing your heart rate to the target heart rate that you need for that quality work of the workout. Many people just do a really, really easy, non-progressive warm up, which doesn't prepare you for the actual cardiovascular quality work. And so this can actually induce myocardial infarctions in elderly populations. You want to ensure that you provide a progressive warm-up to the intensity that the individual will be working at during the quality time of the cardiovascular training session. On this slide, you can see on the left a template that I use a lot for cardiovascular training, especially for a general population. One, it provides good clarity of what is expected of your client for each of the sessions, and it also allows you to be organized and plan accordingly. So as you can see here, there's multiple components, and the first component uses the FIT guidelines. Okay, and these guidelines have low fitness, average fitness, and high fitness, depending on how you classify your client. Low fitness would be a beginner, average fitness would be an intermediate, and high fitness would be an advanced individual who has lots of cardiovascular training experience. Then you can calculate their intensity based on heart rate, resting heart rate, as well as other factors there within the equation. So you have max heart rate minus your resting heart rate times the intensity you want the individual to work at, plus resting heart rate. And this would give you an indication of the target heart rate for that session. And then you can talk about the exercise mode, the type of training that they're going to be doing. And this is where you gather that information from your client. What is their preferred mode of training? Is it elliptical, the bicycle, running, walking, the Stairmaster? There's multiple different other types of cardiovascular training as well. So you have your primary, your secondary, and then a backup mode. And then you start to build exercise into the daily schedule. So I use this as a nice template for a general population individual where the goal is to get them up to 150 minutes per week. That is the minimum standard for health. And remember, this is heart pumping exercise, not just merely going out and walking. You want to ensure that the heart is pumping, that you're getting the cardiovascular stimulus to cause positive change. All right, this next slide talks about the classification of physical activity intensity. And this is known as internal load. So internal load is defined as the physiological response to exercise as measured as something internal to the body. So this would be through the volume of oxygen you consume, so your VO2 or percent of VO2. Heart rate response as a percent of heart rate max or percent of heart rate reserve. Your perceived effort as indicated by your rating of perceived exertion on the Borg scale. Or for strength exercise, a percent of repetition max or 1 RM. So in contrast, external load is your actual training plan, the volume and intensity you are prescribing to your client. The internal load is how their body is responding physiologically to the external load, to the program. So it's really important to get a gauge and to quantify how your program, your external load that you're prescribing, impacts the internal environment. And so you need to pick one of these 4 metrics to monitor intensity. So if you don't have access to a metabolic cart and you don't have access to a heart rate monitor or even being able to measure your own heart rate, then the best thing to use is rating of perceived exertion. And this is where you need to train your client to know how they perceive exercise. And it's getting them familiar with the RPE scale so that they can rate the intensity of exercise, which gives you an indication of how they are responding to your training plan. This is very important because volume and intensity are 2 things that you're tracking to see the stimulus on the body. And so you need to be able to have a measurement of internal load. All right, so here is a sample pace or tempo program for an intermediate 50-kilometer cyclist. So that would be the distance that they compete at, is 50K. So as you can see, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, all the way the whole week is planned out. So as we can see, there's multiple types of endurance rides. We have long, slow distance, tempo, fartlek. You may need another day of rest in there. On Thursday, there's no intervals or hit yet. So the question is, what type of program is this? Is this a block or is it an undulating training plan? Because there's variety in the stimulus, this would be an example of an undulating training plan. What we don't know here, so this would be the external load. This is your prescription that you prescribe. 60 minutes per day. There's no indication of intensity. It's strictly volume. Volume here is in regards to time. You're prescribing time as the external load. So we also need an indication of the internal load. We do not have heart rate, we do not have RPE, and we don't have VO2. So we don't know how these rides are impacting the internal responses of the body. So in this case, it would be easy to say to the client, okay, record what your rating of perceived exertion was for each of those days of training, just to get an indication of how hard they believe they're working at. If we add up the total time from the entire week, we have 300 minutes for the week. But what about the internal load? So we know the volume that you're prescribing, but we have no indication of the internal load, the internal responses from the client on this training plan. So to me, this training plan is incomplete. We have volume, we have the external load, but we're missing the internal load. So you need to have some sort of metric to identify the physiological response to the external load that you've prescribed. This is where many programs fall short. People create cookie cutter programs for an individual. Oh, I'll make you a program. Here you go. And it's only the external load. You give them the program. You haven't assessed them. You don't know what their baseline fitness is, and you give them a program. You give them the volume. And you might give them some intensity, but that's the external load. You're not getting an internal load metric. And without that, you do not know whether the stimulus is appropriate for your client. You do not know whether it's enough of a stimulus or it's too much of a stimulus. You do not know whether they're adhering to the intensity prescription that you've given them. So this can lead to underperformance or fatigue, too much fatigue, and it can lead to overreaching and overtraining or not enough stimulus to drive change. I want to come back to this slide. What about cardiovascular training for a team sport athlete? And really, I said this is very dependent on the time of season, will dictate the type of training you do, whether it's block periodized or undulating. The question I have is, are you losing fitness throughout the competitive season? And this is really dependent on how much playing time you're getting and how many practices you have to maintain the stimulus of all the acquired benefits you got through the off-season training. So if you are actually losing fitness, so this is why testing and spot checks throughout the season is important. If you are losing fitness, you may need a structured cardiovascular training day and days of the week. So for example, you can lose quite a bit of fitness, aerobic as well as strength over a long season. And this is evident in hockey and in the NBA where the season is very long seasons. And if playing time is not enough, players become detrained. And practices may not, because it's more tactical and technical play, may not be enough of a stimulus to maintain the fitness level. So this can be from a conditioning standpoint, but also from a strength standpoint, that NHLers routinely say that they're a lot more weak at the end of the season. They have less muscle at the end of the season, and this is because they haven't maintained that stimulus. So, for example, my husband used to work with the Montreal Canadiens and the Hamilton Bulldogs, which is the AHL team for the Montreal Canadiens. And he was their athletic therapist and strength and conditioning coach. And if a player had less than 10 minutes of playing time in a game, they actually had to do a sprint workout on the bike after the game, as well as a circuit for whole body circuit. So if you didn't get 10 minutes of playing time, you had to hit the gym and you had to do a conditioning workout after because you're actually not getting the stimulus to maintain your fitness, your strength and conditioning piece. And so you would actually lose quite a bit of fitness over the season if it continued that way. So a couple more slides before we move into the new content. The first thing I want to talk about is how long do you repeat the cardiovascular program? And I know we touched on this last day, but it really depends on the length of time for adaptation. And responses vary. Some people respond really quickly and see quick changes, and other people take longer to adapt. And so this is called trainability. How quickly do you adapt? And there's no perfect adaptation. It's just whether you're changing over time, which is the most important thing. So it depends on the trainability of your client, and that's why you do retesting and spot checks regularly to see these changes. The second thing you need to consider is how much time do you have with your client? Do you have how many days per week of training? How many months are they committed to training with you? How many years, if you can get that, if you're working with a team? And this will dictate your block versus undulating and the time investment on certain key performance indicators that are part of the needs analysis. Okay, so for example, if you know you're working with a client for a year, you can actually dedicate specific amounts, specific blocks of time to develop key performance indicators that they need to as a foundation before moving forward. Okay, so for example, if you've identified that their endurance is very much lacking, then you might take a block of time, 6 to 8 weeks, to develop their aerobic fitness base before moving on to an undulating plan or more speed intervals, etc. The third thing is test and retest. These spot checks are so important to track progress and to see how your client is responding to the training plan. And if they're not responding, then you need to make slight changes. You need to ask them how they're feeling, get their sessional rating of perceived exertion, get that internal load to see if the stimulus is big enough to actually drive change. So retesting is really important. These spot checks are so important to track progress, to see if they're adapting to the training plan. And then also consider the phase of the athlete training plan. When is the next competition? And you work backwards from that competition to see how much time you have and how effective you can make their program for their own success. So here is a case study of a general population male age 40. Now you can work through this on your own. And this is great practice because this is where I want you to be going with this. So this is the needs analysis, the gap analysis, and then the goals for the client. Okay, so this individual has no previous injuries, never formally trained before, has played pickup hockey for 2 seasons now, was active as a kid. The occupation is a computer technologist and sedentary for most of the day, wants to become fit and reduce his risk of disease later in life and lose some weight. So the first thing you would want to do is based on your client's profile, complete the chart above. So what you know is that he does have a VO2 max of 32 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So you can determine what type of assessment you would use for this individual. Okay, because he's classified really as sedentary, although he's played hockey for 2 seasons now, which I would assume is 1 day per week. That's relatively sedentary. I would start him as a beginner, and I would probably do a submax indirect aerobic fitness test. So that's submax. You're not bringing him to max. You're using predictive equations to determine what the max is. And you're also doing it indirectly. So that means you don't have him hooked up to a metabolic cart because he's not familiar with this and there's no need for this. You can track his changes over time by repeating the same submax indirect test. So then based on the chart above, you would classify your client's cardiovascular fitness level. And then I would want you to complete the chart on the right for your client, including a weekly program that is achievable and at the level for your client. So this is a skill I really want you to know well by the end of the semester. If we were in class, I would get you to spend 10 to 15 minutes on this particular case study where you're doing a needs analysis. You know he's sedentary. You know he wants to improve fitness. You see his motivation. You see that he does a little recreational sports. How you would then assess him, how you would do a gap analysis, and then create a general program for this individual. And this is a skill that I want you to be able to have. Okay? Program design is really a combination of science and the art of creating a plan. And as you do it more, the easier it becomes and the better you are at creating a plan catered to your client. So just remember the goals of program design is really about preventing injuries, injury prevention. So identifying what the needs are of your client and what are common injuries associated with those needs, and trying to improve the strength and robustness of your client by preventing the injuries. So working in those common areas to prevent injuries. So making them strong in those areas. The second is to enhance the ability to tolerate demands through system capacity and structural tolerance improvements. Okay, so based on the goals, based on the demand analysis or needs analysis, their gap analysis, you're going to create a cardiovascular training program that improves their system's capacity and their structural tolerance to work out at that capacity. And then the third piece is enhance their performance. Now, performance is all relative to your client. For an athlete, it's their actual athletic performance. For a general population, it may be their performance of tasks of everyday life, or it could be their occupational demands become easier. Now, that's an indication that they've enhanced their performance of their functional ability. Okay, so keep those three things in mind. These are the goals of program design. It's not just the middle, it's preventing injuries and common injury sites and enhancing their performance in tasks of everyday life in whatever relative performance that they have.